In a place designed to be unsurvivable, is there any music? Growing up learning about the Holocaust, my mind pictured the horrific scenes of human evil and suffering. Later in life, my mother mentioned something to me that seemed so strange I thought I'd misheard her. She said that concentration camps had orchestras. She was right, and to my surprise, there is evidence for many different musical experiences that took place within Nazi concentration camps. In this clip from a documentary made in 1979, Auschwitz survivor Kitty Hart revisits the camp with her son and describes to him the women's orchestra.
Here, somewhere here, was the orchestra. A full orchestra, right? Just imagine it. Prison orchestra.
Yes.
Alma Rose conducting. She was a very famous musician. She died.
One of the more documented cases of organised music was the women's camp orchestra that existed in Auschwitz-Birkenau between the years of 1943 and 1945. This was the only concentration camp orchestra where women were allowed to participate. Through ethnography and a cultural historical perspective, I will critically analyse the impact of the use of music upon victims in concentration camps, by looking particularly at the women's orchestra. The Holocaust was a genocide that took place between the years of 1939 and 1945 in Europe. It was an organised attempt to destroy the entire Jewish population of Nazi Germany and its occupied lands. Millions of Jewish people, along with other undesirables such as political enemies and the disabled, were forced onto cattle cars and transported to SS-controlled camps, where they were either worked or gassed to death. In the words of musicologist Shirley Gilbert, the endless hunger, lack of access to basic necessities, and the arbitrary punishments to which they were subjected to meant that their attention was overwhelmingly focused on their physical survival. Yet, music was a feature in these scenes. It was both enforced by the SS in ways such as through forced singing sessions, and secretly took place among the victims as a way of remembering their former lives and receiving a little comfort. But how could genocide and music coexist? I echo the same questions Joseph Moreno asks about the Nazis' use of music in camps. He writes, "How could genuine music sentiment and mass murder comfortably coexist? How could the citizens of the country that gave us Bach, Beethoven and Brahms not only have been Hitler's willing executioners, but even have used that very same music to aid in the extermination process of millions of Jews and many other victims?" The Women's Camp Orchestra in Birkenau, the second Auschwitz camp, began under the orders of the Nazi SS supervisor Maria Mandel and Commander Franz Hosler in 1943. At its peak, the orchestra was made up of about 45 musicians and 4 music copyists, all taken from the prisoner population. It is arguable that by looking at this ensemble, we can see an example of the kind of ambiguous morality that was a theme in all prison camp orchestras. One impact that the SS intended for the orchestra to have was to increase their control over the large prison population. According to Shirley Gilbert, about all the prison orchestras, they played a valuable role in the extermination process, helping the operation to run smoothly and assisting in the maintenance of discipline and order. Possessing the tool of music meant that in military-style fashion, the Nazis could force exhausted prisoners to march to the beat of the orchestra in the mornings and evenings on their way to and from forced work. This was another way that the SS could terrorise its victims and create petty calls for more violence and murder. In addition to this, Esther Baranio, who was a pianist in the women's orchestra, wrote that they would play when the trains arrived and the people were forced directly to the gas. In this clip, Kitty Hart speaks of those entering the gas chambers.
I think the people who were queuing up to the gas chambers had a feeling that there was some sort of life for them because they saw us perhaps well fed and in reasonable condition, and that it gave them hope of a better life, although the whole atmosphere must have been very sinister.
Kitty goes on to say how she felt that distraction and ignorance was overall beneficial for the victims. I agree and think that the orchestra would have contributed towards this, allowing the victims to at least have a calmer death. Further supporting this view, the orchestra pianist and survivor Esther Bejarano writes, "The deported waved to us in a friendly way because they thought, when the music is playing, that can't be so bad. That was part of the tactic of the SS. As a violinist myself, would I have wanted to turn back and give up my status, as I realised the extent to which I was a part of the SS's murderous scheme? I wonder how I would have felt watching the people wander past the orchestra, perhaps enjoying the music for a moment, but then being led to their murder." Another impact that the Birkenau Women's Orchestra had on the victims was that it caused division within them. One survivor, who was used as forced labour, wrote, "The orchestra in Birkenau played marches and modern foxtrots. It makes you sick. We couldn't stand the music, or the musicians. They were like puppets, all in blue skirts and white collars sitting on comfortable chairs." It can be assumed that the anger this writer felt towards their relative comfort and apparent betrayal through cooperation with the SS would have been echoed by many other prisoners. In an interview, survivor and cellist in the Women's Orchestra, Anita Lasker-Wolfish, acknowledges the varied reactions towards the music from the victims.
However suspect that music was, the reaction to this music was very varied. I've read in books, that it was terribly offensive to hear music in Auschwitz, and other people who said it was wonderful to shut your eyes for a few minutes and to think yourself out of this disaster area, into something.
The Nazis actively encouraged division and hierarchy within the camp prisoners through various means, to make the chance of a unified, organised rebellion even less likely. The orchestra members were treated significantly better than the normal prison population. They lived in a music block, where they had a functioning heater. They were able to access enough food to prevent starvation, were exempt from wearing the striped uniform, and were not forced to do any physical outdoor work. Anita describes that the music block was a relative haven. She also writes that for us in our privileged position, the roll call was held inside during the winter months. This is one example of the kind of privileges the musicians benefited from. These privileges allowed some of them to survive for a very long time compared with normal prisoners. However, to receive these privileges, in the words of Anita, we always had to be ready to play for the SS personnel who came into our block for light relief after their exhausting work of determining who should live and who should die. This was something that orchestra members struggled with, as they knew they were providing entertainment for those who murdered their family and friends. I can imagine that if I was an orchestra member, I would have felt intensely guilty that I still had fat on my bones. However, I would have known that unless I played, I would have been forced to a gas chamber. Therefore, I would have been stuck in a constant confliction. The greatest impact the orchestra had was experienced by the members themselves. In her autobiography, Inherit the Truth, Anita writes, "I will never know what prompted me to tell her that I played the cello. It might have seemed a superfluous piece of information under the circumstances, but I did tell her, and her reaction was quite unexpected. 'That is fantastic,' she said, and grabbed me. 'Stand aside, you will be saved.' This striking moment shows how the orchestra acted as a lifeboat for the orchestra members' physical survival." She writes, "The only prerequisite for being there was that you had a more or less remote idea how to hold a played instrument. Any excuse was good enough to attempt to rescue as many people as possible and bring them into this relative haven. Some people who could not really play at all were taken in. Their task was to copy music, because all the works we played had to be arranged and orchestrated for a peculiar collection of instruments. In an interview, Anita describes the situation that was created due to the mixed abilities of the orchestra members and the role Alma Rose, the orchestra's conductor, played.
And also, we were such a bad orchestra. I mean, we were just sort of amateur kids, you know. Some of them, we were about 5 people who could play properly. That the job of Alma was to make something possible out of us, which meant that Alma was very strict. We were scared of Alma, you know, forgot temporarily to look out of the window where the chimneys were going.
This is Gustav Mahler's niece.
Yeah.
In addition to their physical survival, the orchestra allowed the members to retain their sense of humanity and dignity. Anita regards this as the most important impact the orchestra had, as described when she writes about a particular evening of performing chamber music for the SS. We were able to raise ourselves high above the inferno of Auschwitz into spheres where we could not have been touched by the degradation of concentration camp existence. She also says, I think that probably the most important thing was that, although my head was shaved and I had a number on my arm, I had not lost my identity totally. I was the cellist. In conclusion, the SS enforced women's orchestra had a significant and varying impact on the victims of the Birkenau camp. For some normal prisoners, it brought a little comfort and distraction, but for others, it worsened their torment. For the orchestra members, it saved them. As I walked through the Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum a few weeks ago, I read this quotation on a wall. I want the coming generation to remember our times. I don't know my fate. I don't know whether I will be able to tell you what happened later. How important is it then that these musicians did survive to tell us about horrors inside the camps? To end this presentation, I will play a poignant recording made on the 20th of April 1945, 5 days after Bergen-Belsen camp was liberated. In this recording, we can hear the power that music had for these victims at the moment of liberation. Thank you for watching my research presentation.
The day I reached Belsen concentration camp, the 5th day of liberation, was a Friday, the day before the Jewish Sabbath. Around us lay the corpses that there had not been time to clear away, even after 5 days. And people were still lying down and dying in broad daylight in front of our eyes. This was the background to this open-air Jewish service. These people knew they were being recorded. They wanted the world to hear their voice. They made a tremendous effort, which quite exhausted them. Yisrael Chai, the children of Israel still liveth.